So we now come to the corporate governance of listed companies. This is a little bit difficult in the sense that the curriculum doesn't give you too many questions, and I think one thing that you can do is just follow along with me and try to learn at least everything on these slides. If you do that, then there is a good chance that you'll be covered. Obviously, at this stage, with less than 4 weeks left for your exam, it doesn't make sense to be reading the whole chapter in the book. So just remember the main points and then try to work on this through past mock exams and other practice sources. The definition. Corporate governance is the system of internal controls and procedures by which individual companies are managed. It provides a framework that defines the rights, roles, and responsibilities of various groups within an organization. And those groups that we are talking about are board members / directors, shareholders, and company management. Here we are generally talking about senior management. This definition is extremely important, and I'd encourage you to remember the definition. Good corporate governance seeks to ensure that board members act in the best interest of shareholders, company acts in a lawful and ethical manner, shareholders have the right to participate in the governance of the company and receive fair treatment, rights of shareholders and other stakeholders are clearly delineated and communicated, board and its committees are structured to act independently from management, and appropriate controls are in place covering management's activities. So these bullet points are also important. The larger point that you need to keep in mind when answering corporate governance questions is that always look for things that are beneficial to the shareholder. The board is extremely important because it represents the shareholders. And one of your biggest concerns will be a board that aligns more with management and less with shareholders. So that's what you are looking for. When evaluating the board, this is what you should consider. And note that the title of this reading says a manual for investors. So as an investor, these are the things that you look for when deciding whether to invest in a company or not. Determine whether the board has a majority of independent board members. Ideally, there should be a majority. If the independent board members are not in majority, then that would be a concern. And subsequent slides go into the more important points. You determine whether the board members have the necessary qualifications. Are they properly trained? Are they running a function that they have past experience in? Determine whether the board has the authority to hire third-party consultants. If they want, they should be able to do so. Determine whether elections are annual or staggered. Annual is supposed to be better for shareholders. Determine whether the board has established a committee to oversee the audit of the company's financial reports. Determine whether the board has established a committee of independent board members who set executive compensation. Why is it so important to be independent? Because you don't want the board, you don't want a board dominated by the management to decide their own salaries, for example. Determine whether the board has established a nominations committee of independent board members that is responsible for recruiting board members, and this nominations committee will also recruit the CEO. All right, independence is extremely important, and I'll not read through this, but I want you to do so. These are the items that you look at in determining whether a board member is independent or not. When evaluating board independence, investors should determine whether the independent board members constitute a majority. In fact, a best practice is that independent board members should be 3/4 of the board or more. Independent board members meet regularly without management presence. You want that to happen. The board chair is also the chief executive. You don't want this to happen. It, in practice, is quite common, but according to corporate governance best practices, the chairman of the board should not be the CEO. Board members are aligned with company suppliers, customers, or management. So this also ideally should not happen. These are the things you are looking for. So if you see this, so this is a red flag. Board chair is also chief executive. This is a red flag. Independent board members meet regularly without management present. This is good. Independent board members majority. This is good. Board member qualifications, you can read this, but on the exam, if you don't remember the exact details, be logical. Obviously, if you have a board member running the audit committee and he does not have any finance background, that clearly is not a good thing. Audit committee, the audit committee's primary responsibility is to ensure that the financial information reported by the company to shareholders is complete, accurate, reliable, relevant, and timely. Audit committee is responsible for hiring and supervising external auditors. Investors should determine whether all board members serving on the audit committee are independent, extremely important. All committee members are considered financial experts. Committee has authority to approve or reject non-audit engagements with an audit firm. This is important. When you engage with an audit firm, typically that audit firm will also have other businesses such as risk advisory, for example. Now, if you engage them for audit work and you also engage them for risk advisory, then what is the issue? In order to get more risk advisory work, the audit firm might overlook some of the issues in your financial statement. So what the audit committee needs to do is maybe take a tough position and limit any non-audit work given to your audit firm. You should also check whether the committee has unimpeded access to internal auditor. So if the committee wants, they should go to the internal auditor without the approval of the CEO or CFO or any manager in the company. Remuneration compensation committee, this is fairly self-evident. I want you to read this. This obviously should consist of independent board members. And the same holds true with nominations. This also should largely be independent board members. If I were to pick the most important theme across the board, it is independence. So obviously try to learn everything, but that independence of the board is perhaps the most important element in corporate governance. Coming now to management. So what do you look at? Determine whether the company has adopted a code of ethics. Determine whether company allows insiders to use company assets for personal reasons. Is this good or bad? Obviously this is bad. Determine whether management compensation is reasonable. Determine whether incentive structure of management is aligned with shareholder interest, and so on. So note that all these are fairly common sense. Read them a few times and then on the exam, when all else fails, use common sense. Code of ethics. A company's code of ethics sets standards for ethical conduct that are based on principles of integrity, trust, and honesty. When evaluating a company's code of ethics, investors should determine whether the company gives the board access to relevant information in a timely manner, has an ethical code which is enforced, and so on. Make sure you read this a few times. And then we come to shareholders. So note, we've talked about the board, we've talked about management, and now we are talking about the third critical set of stakeholders, which is the shareholders. When evaluating shareholder rights, consider the following. Now, what is the larger picture here? You are determining whether to become a shareholder. So you are a potential investor. Determine whether shareholders can vote without attending meetings. Is this a good thing? This is a good thing. You want, as a shareholder, to be able to vote without being there. If you are asked to show up at the company headquarters every time and only vote then, how many people would go to the shareholder meeting? Hardly anyone. So remember, you always want things that make your life as a shareholder easier. So with that in mind, you can now read the rest. But I'm trying to give you the principle, because on the exam it's very hard to remember every bullet point, but it's easier to remember the principles. Shareholder voting. When analyzing the ownership structure of a company, investors should consider whether there are different classes of shares and how voting rights differ between them. Okay. So there are different classes of shares and how voting rights differ between them. Shareholders with inferior voting rights are protected, and so on. There is this concept of cumulative voting, which is a good thing. We'll talk about this in more detail in equity, but cumulative voting gives the small shareholder more rights. All right, the final point here with regards to corporate finance is takeover defenses. Again, I'll give you the principle. As an investor, you do not like takeover defenses. Why? Because as an investor, you want the share price to go up. If the share price goes up, you are better off. A takeover defense is a way for management to remain entrenched. So when reviewing a company's anti-takeover measures, you should inquire whether the company is required to receive approval prior to implementation, inquire whether the company has received any acquisition offers and whether the takeover defenses were used. So again, key point is that as an investor, you do not like takeover defenses.